Thanks so much, Rory. And yeah, thanks for having me back. I remember very well a meeting a few years ago. Pablo Yanguas was there. I think he hadn't quite published his book, or maybe he had, can't remember. It was about that time. And it was really useful feedback that you guys gave. And we've been working on this idea for a long time. And the reason why kind of wanted to call this talk Why We Can Now Win is because I feel like we're in a different moment to back then. So back then, and I'll do a bit of like what is global public investment and what the proposal is and stuff like that, obviously, because I mean that I have to explain that. But that was a time when I guess this idea was being built, and it still felt like a kind of radical critique of the aid sector and a somewhat unlikely transformative proposal. Now it feels very different, and it's mostly COVID. That's the reason for that, and I'll explain why. But it feels like now we're not in the situation of explaining what GPI is and even asking if it's a good idea. We're now getting through to the, is it possible? And then, is it a priority? And then actually we're now at the stage of asking, what's the political strategy for making it done? Because so much change has happened over the last few years. And that's why, I've had to be persuaded by my peers and my colleagues and my friends about the political viability of this idea. Because certainly for most of my working life, and I guess a lot of people around the room, where maybe there's a bunch of people that are probably quite younger, the idea of structural change has been a chimera. It's been very, very difficult to achieve, and not just in my working life. I mean, before I was born, I mean, it's not the first time that people have put grand global structural changes, more representative decision making on the agenda. Pretty much every time it's been batted back, pretty much by the USA and colleagues and allies of the USA to try and maintain the kind of power that it maintains over the post-war global financial order and international order. And so I think the question that I want to try and answer now, and especially have people's views on, is have things changed significantly enough, both for the longer term? I say COVID is the biggest reason. That's the short term reason. The longer term shift is this gradual shift of wealth and power from north to south, to some extent from west to east. And have the conditions shifted such that the ambition of a genuinely representative, not perfect, let's not kind of build the paradise. There's a great quote I was reading the other day from Dag Hammarskjöld, who was, I think, the founding Secretary General of the UN, who said the UN was not built to build paradise on earth. It was to get us out of hell. He said it better than me. That was not the quote. It was to get us out of hell effectively. The point being, at that time, it was post-World War, and it's not about building a utopia. We're not naive. It's about building something significantly better than we have at the moment, and that's what we're going for. Solomon's just come in with his Pokemon cards. It would be just great if you would just shut the door on your way out. That means going out first. Yep, and then shutting the door. Thank you. Apologies for that. So the proposal on the table is a new way of doing international cooperation, particularly the financial aspects of international cooperation. Is it a good idea? I think the answer to that is very clearly yes. There are enough critiques of the aid system that I can assume, I think, in this crowd, that I don't need to go over too much why we need a significant change. But let me just set out the 5 evolutions at the heart of the global public investment idea that were honed through conversations with like the ones I had in Manchester a few years ago, and with many other people around the world, especially in the global south. I've been living in Colombia for a long time, and a lot of these ideas emerged from discussions with Latin Americans who've been building South-South cooperation over the last 10, 20 years, and something quite specifically Latin, but also linked with the rest of the world. Also, of course, have been hugely influential in trying to shift the global economic order for decades. So we kind of honed the 5 paradigm shifts that we're calling for, more or less down to these. Firstly, in ambition. And this is something the SDGs have already set out, not just to reduce or end poverty, however noble and important that ambition is, but a far broader ambition than that, to promote sustainable development and to end inequality, or rather not necessarily to end inequality, maybe that's too naive, but to significantly reduce it, and crucially to build convergence so that countries converge to a standard of living that is considered acceptable in the 21st century. That's a very different proposal to eliminating the worst kinds of poverty. The poverty line is set arbitrarily, both in terms of the national of what counts as a low income, middle income, or high income country, and what counts as the absolute poor, the $1 a day, $2 a day, $5 a day, whatever you care to mention. These are all arbitrary. I'm sure some people in this call know a lot more about the history of those than I do. But what I do know, because I've talked to the people that did it, including Lance Pritchett, is that the poverty line developed by the World Bank in the early 90s is entirely arbitrary. And not only is it arbitrary, I think more importantly, it's incredibly stingy. So we're talking about people emerging from poverty when they get over this kind of incredibly stingy understanding of what is a decent human life, one that we would not accept in the North, in the global North. And yet we have this language of when they reach this threshold, it's time possibly for the international community to move on and to start thinking about other things because, quotes, a country has moved out of poverty or a community has moved out of poverty. So we're stuck with this incredibly stingy and arbitrary poverty line. You know, of course, international corporations are not always been focused on poverty. That was really, I guess, in the 90s, there was this huge focus on poverty, which one has to support. But it's not, it should, before that, there was a lot of more focus on infrastructure and economic growth more generally. But it has to be one aspect of the overall sustainable development global common objectives. And like I said, the SDGs have laid down that bar. The paradigm shift is not required in our global thinking, but it's required in the financing of that, because the aid sector is still very much attached. The biggest players in the aid sector are still very much attached to the idea that this is about reducing, ideally eliminating poverty, and then effectively moving on. India doesn't need aid anymore. Ghana doesn't need aid anymore. The whole of South America don't need aid anymore. Vietnam doesn't need aid anymore, because aid is fundamentally for eliminating poverty. And that leads on to the second paradigm shift that we're talking about, which is about the function of aid or international public finance or concessional international public finance, whatever you want to call it. And it would be interesting to hear people's views on what I'm about to say. But I don't think there is today at least, a viable or coherent theory of aid. It seems to me to be kind of instinct of the moment, but where is the really thorough thinking through of what is the role of concessional international public finance in promoting sustainable development? It's the right thing to do, it's the moral thing to do. But is it, that's often argued, but how does it work? What's the point of it? And the narrative that we tell ourselves, so insofar as there's a theory of aid, I would say it's this: it's a short-term support, capital injection to very poor countries to help them in a specific moment of their history until they no longer need it, when other sources of funds come on board, be they private funds internationally or domestic, or domestic, what we call domestic public resources, taxes, etc. Even remittances in some countries is a huge proportion of the economy. The role of aid is to fill a gap until it's no longer required, either because more funds come available or because countries move out of a particular threshold and, quote, graduate from the requirement for concessional international public finance. And I think that has to be fundamentally challenged. And indeed, I think I'm not the only one that thinks that. I was reading an article a couple of days ago by Ngozi and Larry Summers, talking about how we need to move on from understanding spending on health security as aid to those that need it, move on from that to global investment in what we all need, which is a fundamentally different, and we'll come on to narrative in a second, but this idea that international public finance, concessional international public finance can be replaced eventually because it's a short-term blip, has to be challenged. We would never make that mistake, and I always make this case, at the national level. We would never say in the UK, the health system needs funding. It doesn't matter where that money's from. We only need public funding insofar as there's no other funds. And when there are other funds available, private money, foundation money, charity, your own pocket, then we don't need public money anymore. Because we understand quite instinctively and obviously that different types of money have different characteristics, and that a publicly funded health system is going to clearly be different. So obvious, hardly worth stating, to a privately funded health system because of accountability, because of interest, because of incentives and all those kind of things. Different types of money have different characteristics, which makes them differently important, not just because of the quantity, but because of the quality, the characteristics of that money. So just before the SDG conference, which signed up to the SDGs in September 2015, there was a meeting in Addis Ababa. Some of you may have been there, may have read about it. I was there. I was actually there with a guy called Homi Karas. I was having dinner with him the very night that whole thing was signed. This kind of what they call Addis Ababa Action Agenda, I think it was called, or Agenda for Action. And it was about how do you finance the SDGs. And I remember I mentioned Homi because he's mega kind of influential with the whole SDGs, but also interesting, I was listening to him talk yesterday, and he said there is a realization that that relying or waiting for private money to support climate finance in particular, but much more broadly, is something of a chimera. And it's also the easiest way for wealthy countries to get off the hook. Because what they say is, and this is exactly what they said in Addis 6 years ago when we were talking about financing the SDGs, they said this: there's so much that needs to be done. Look at the SDGs, it's so big, so much bigger than the MDGs. Look at climate. It's not about billions of dollars, it's about trillions of dollars. And they're right. So the famous paper at the time was written by the World Bank and the regional development banks and IMF. It's called From Billions to Trillions. And it was about how do you move from the billions in aid effectively to the trillions required to finance sustainable development that can only come from the private sector. So the whole focus was on private money. Yeah, private money is really important. Of course it is. I mean, it goes without saying. But this was an attempt, whether they realized it or not, the negotiators, to get the wealthy countries off the hook with regard to their public money responsibilities. And it was also a theoretical, to come back to the theory, a theoretical misunderstanding of the very special nature of international public money. You can't just get private money to focus on the most marginalized communities, the poorest countries, social sectors in a way that is appropriate and inclusive. There are so many areas that you need public money for. In fact, and I'm not an expert on this, but in fact, people tell me that even for things like infrastructure in the wealthy North, in decades past or centuries past, was funded by public money, because private money, or at least significantly funded by public money. So even the things that we think of as economically viable actually also require a large amount of public money because of the type of that money. So even though public money, international public money, is always going to be a small percentage of the overall amount of money internationally available for development or sustainable development, climate, even though it's always going to be a small percentage, it is a fallacy, it's fallacious logic to say it's a small percentage and therefore it's not very important, therefore let's not bother to focus on it, which is what you'll hear quite a lot certainly have in the last few years in discussions about development finance. It's so small, why would we bother even talking about it? So let's let it kind of die and let's focus on the big money. Yeah, you wouldn't say that if it was the last tree in the forest. Oh, it doesn't matter. Let's just chop it down. We've got rid of all the other trees. Small, and I'm sorry to use this phrase, size isn't everything, right? Quality is, in this context, and the characteristics of public money is so important. So that's the second shift in our understanding. The third paradigm shift is with regards to geography. And again, this is already well underway. The idea that the money arrives from the North and is spent in developing countries in the South. already for many decades has been false. China has not suddenly arrived on the scene. It's massively more bigger than it was, but it's not. But it's been engaged in South-South cooperation for many decades. So have many other countries. So it's never been true, quite true. Although yes, the vast majority of the money arrives from the north for international cooperation. But that's changing. Almost all countries, or many countries, I don't know the numbers, but very many countries nowadays have contribute money to international development and have a cooperation agency. I lived in Colombia for a long time, and its cooperation agency had one directorate for receiving funds and one directorate for contributing funds and cooperation, especially in the region. So again, how does that play in the theory of aid, which says aid is about a gap in capital? We need to fill that gap. How does that make sense if some countries are giving and also receiving? I mean, India spends I don't know how many billion and receives I don't know how many billion. China receives a lot less. It's quite similar in India. They're quite similar amounts. In China, obviously, it gives a hell of a lot more, contributes or rather invests a hell of a lot more, and then receives a lot less. But a lot of countries receive and give nowadays roughly the same amounts. Look at Mexico, those kind of places. So how does that make sense? Because the money is special. And I'll come on to an analogy with the European Union in a sec. So anyway, the geography has to change. And when the geography changes, we can say the kind of, I guess, radical proposal at the heart of global public investment, which is all contribute, all countries contribute, not just some. All countries can benefit. And crucially then, all countries decide. And that's the heart of the shift that we're proposing in this new approach. And that's the fourth paradigm, a shift in governance. So if you look at the way the European Union operates, and it's an analogy that only goes so far because it's a specific region with a specific history and a specific political union that I don't think anyone is putting on the table yet for the globe. But you have a system effectively whereby all countries, even the poorest, put money in. So the poorest countries in Europe are in Eastern Europe, used to be in Southern Europe. And ever since the 70s, they have contributed to the European Union budget. All countries receive, interestingly. So even the wealthiest countries, Germany, France, receive money from the EU budget. So they're net contributors. They put in a hell of a lot more than they get back, but they do get back. That's concessional international public money. That's grant money that Germany receives from an international pot. How does that make sense in the theory of aid, which says aid is fundamentally about filling gaps? Well, why would Germany put in, I don't know how much it is, I'm making it up, 15 billion and receive back 1 billion? Why doesn't it just keep the 1 billion and put in 14 billion? That's what makes sense. If it's just about money, but it's not, because it's about cohesion. It's about different types of accountability. It's about building a European-wide strategy. So understanding the different characteristics of different kinds of money explains why the European system exists in the way it does. All contribute, some more than others. All receive, some more than others, and crucially, all decide. So the poorest countries in the Union also sit at the table every month in Brussels to discuss how the budget, every 7 years, I think it is, to discuss the broad aspects of the budget, and then the whole way through to discuss specific decisions around the budget. So sure, Romania isn't ever going to be as powerful in Germany in those discussions, but there is a system whereby they sit down and discuss. How million miles away is that from the way that we do things globally, whereby the wealthy countries effectively decide how they're going to spend their money, and the poorer countries effectively wait and hope that things work out for them? Why can't we imagine a system whereby all countries contribute, the poorest countries receive a hell of a lot more back than they put in, the richest countries also might receive some money to support specific aspects of sustainable development? In the European Union, it's focused on small and medium-sized businesses. It's focused on green transport and green energy, marginalized communities, which exist, of course, in rich countries as well as all countries. So that kind of vision for how it, for what it might look like, is at the heart of the global public investment idea. And we can talk about what the governance of that would look like, because it would be mega complex, quite obviously, at the global level. And then the final piece is about narrative. We have to evolve from talking about charity and aid and help and neediness to talking about common ideals, working together, to and investment. An investment, of course, implies a return, not a financial return, but an economic, social, environmental return, not just spending money abroad, which is how it's been presented for so many years. And I think that's one of the main reasons, that focus on governance, and especially that focus on narrative, that has made people excited by this. Because just take Rishi Sunak turning up at the dispatch box in Britain a year ago. Can't remember exactly when, but when he came to explain that the 0.7% wasn't going to be met, and the 0.5% was going to be reduced, age was going to be reduced to 0.5%. That makes sense to some extent in a world where it's charity, where we haven't even got enough at home. So how can we possibly help those miles away? That's the narrative that's being told, that actually we have been telling, even as an NGO sector, and I come from the NGO sector, the narrative we've been telling for many decades. But what if the narrative was something different? That this money, as I've said from that Ngozi and Summers article, this money is not being sent abroad, but it's being invested in our common well-being. It makes much less sense for the Chancellor to come and say, well, at this moment of crisis, we're reducing money in our global health security, which is clearly in our own interests. So that's the narrative kind of shift that is required actually to make progress in maintaining high levels of funding in the North, but also crucially, because the global South is just fed up with it. I mean, it's an afterthought in when I have these discussions in the global North, and like, oh yeah, well, ideally we'd change the language. I mean, obviously, we'd like to talk about dignity and solidarity and stuff like that. But I mean, if the language of aid works and it brings in the money, this is regular conversations in the NGO sector, by the way, and I've had a lot of them. I used to be policy director at Save the Children and had this fight, about how we present all of this stuff. If it brings in the money, well, that's the most important thing. That's not how it's seen in much of the global South. It's seen as insulting, 20th century, post-colonial, neo-colonial, disrespectful, and that it's not true that humans only care about money and growth. People care about dignity. People care about being respected. They care about their presidents being respected and their governments being respected. They care about being talked about in a particular way. And I think that has to come right to the top of anything we do on global cooperation. And I think, with the push in recent years on decolonizing aid, and of course that was related to the Black Lives Matter campaign. I think that's really, really important. I think we have to decolonize our language as well. So that's the kind of global public investment idea. As I've said, I don't think I'm going to find many people in this group that are going to disagree with that. They may well be, and I don't mean to kind of, speak for you. Get involved, let's discuss those principles. But increasingly what I'm finding is that, people are like, well, yeah, kind of obvious. Of course, we'd like that system. The question is it possible? And that's where I think things are beginning to be exciting. And I think that's very related to COVID. So the major, I won't go into it because I've realized that I've kind of rambled on already quite a long time, and it would be nice to kind of come to an end quite soon. But the main global geopolitical shift of the last 20 years, really I'd say the last 20 years, 25 years, is a shift of wealth and power to the South. Now, clearly the North is significantly more powerful still, but the global South can organize itself to win stuff nowadays. And actually the SDGs is a good example of that, where the global North, I'm using the general terms, and I apologize for them, it's not accurate, but the global North, broadly speaking, was calling for an MDG plus set of goals, let's call them. So basically the MDGs, maybe with a few tweaks. The global South, G77, was saying, no, we need a thoroughly different agenda, the SDGs. As what turned out, the SDGs are a kind of holistic approach to global development. And there was a big fight. I mean, there was really serious advocacy being done to stop that. And the North lost. The SDGs were were a win for the global South. And I think that augurs well for the possibility that this time there could be more wins. Obviously, I think it's obvious, things relating to large amounts of money are going to be harder to win than things relating to fundamentally a signature on a piece of paper. But there are many ways to demonstrate how power has shifted and how things could change. And then the other shorter term change is COVID. So there is, and I've spoken to a lot of people on the African continent especially, but also in Latin America, genuine anger at the highest levels of government, of course there is, about the way that the vaccines have been not rolled out, and decisions that have been made about support for saving lives in the health crisis that all countries are facing, but also responding to the economic crisis that countries are also now facing, quite obviously, and very dangerous levels of debt in many countries around the world, while the wealthy countries have money in their pockets just about to survive economically. That's not true of most countries in the South. So decisions are being made that are quite clearly and just more obviously than ever. We've always known that there's great inequality in the world. Of course, we've known that, but it's become more obvious than ever in the last year or two. And speaking to governments and advocates around the world, it feels like there is momentum behind the idea that if this happens again in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, we are not going to be in this situation again. We know it's going to be tough, but we're definitely not going to be in this situation again, where we have to get a plane to Paris or Washington or London to beg for money. Okay, that's not going to happen. So what can we do? We know we need tons more money in the international space, but we know that needs to be public money, because private money can only do certain stuff, even though it's really, really important as well. But we also know that that money can't be governed in the way it's currently governed. And you hear anecdotes even now of the World Bank kind of, because of the crises that a lot of countries around the world are now facing, they haven't been facing in the last few years. We're doing okay. But suddenly they're in crisis, financial crisis again, and the World Bank's power is being reignited in terms of laying down conditions to shift policies in clients around the world. So is it possible? It's definitely possible. Is it going to happen? It's a totally different question, right? I mean, that depends on so many different global contextual things. I think it's still going to be really hard to make those kind of structural changes, but it's definitely possible in a way that it wasn't before. Is it a priority? And then I'll come on to very briefly, how can we get it done? So is it a good idea? Yes. Is it possible? Yes, definitely more so than it has been at any other time in my professional career. And I would say this going further: if it's not possible now, it's never going to be possible, so we might as well just forget about it. Yeah, because this is a moment of crisis that needs to be a moment of opportunity. But is it a priority? And I think yes, it is, for two reasons. And that's an important question, because it's one thing to discuss this academically, and in this context, I am actually with academics. But it's another thing to put money, time, and resources, limited money, time, and resources, behind an advocacy program of structural change when there are, which is far from being certain to be achieved, when there are many urgent priorities that might mean much more rapid change for people. And so, is this a priority to try and work out the structural change that I guess global public investment proposes? And the answer to that is yes, because governance matters. It's not going to be okay to have, and I've said this already, to have much more money. It needs to be governed better, and this is a proposal for how to do that. And aid effectiveness attempts, which I've been very involved in over the last, not so much in the last few years, but certainly when they were big in 2005, 2010, the whole aid effectiveness agenda, I think progress was really made. But I think we've gone back a lot from that, and that's what you see when you don't shift power, when you don't shift structures. You see progress for 5 years, and then snap, and you go backwards, because it's not in the interests of these particular governments to follow through on participatory approaches anymore. It's not in the interest of these particular governments to have ownership in the South anymore, because all of a sudden the global context has changed, and we didn't have the institutions in place or the structures concretized to actually keep any progress that had been made. So yes, it is a priority. And then the other, I guess, good news on whether it's a priority or not is that I've set it up, and I'm going to say that I set it up wrongly. I set it up wrongly as between short-term and long-term objectives, because the good news about global public investment that we're discovering, and I'm learning about this all the time, is that there are short-term wins that lead to progress, to progress in the long term. So there are new funds being set up almost weekly or being talked about across the world. We're talking with people who are setting up a global fund for social protection. We're talking to the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria and Tuberculosis. There's the Costa Rican proposal at the moment on the table for a new fund to support countries in the South going through economic crises. There's new funds being proposed on health pretty much every day. Are these funds going to follow the principles of aid, which is some countries put in and pretty much decide the agenda, and some countries apply for some of the money? Or are they going to follow the principles of global public investment, which says all countries put in, depending on their ability to do so, all countries are able to benefit, depending on requirements, and crucially, all countries have some level of decision making about how the money is spent. And there are funds already that have moved in that direction. The global fund that I mentioned is one of them. It's probably the fund that I know that's most follows the global public investment principles. So how do we get there? That's the big question, I think. Things have moved very rapidly in the last couple of years, and those of us that have been advocating global public investment are in a very different situation, as I said when I started, to when we came to Manchester a couple of years ago to discuss building this idea. And we're now in a situation where we've got to have a political strategy, not just technical analysis. We've got to move from getting the idea honed to bringing political support behind it from governments, because this ultimately is going to be a UN route, G20, the various regional areas. And I think crucially also through funds, through specific funds, as I've mentioned, new funds that could adopt these principles and demonstrate that they work better in practice. Because ultimately, I guess I may have kind of emphasized that this is the theoretically right thing to do. But also theoretically, it's going to be more effective because more participation and more ownership of countries and communities that are benefiting from money should mean more effective spending of that money. It's going to require a lot of campaigning, so bringing in civil society, a different narrative, educational and effective communications to persuade communities and voters throughout the world that this is in their interests and it's something that they should back. And it's going to require further technical development of the proposal, because when it comes to governing a global system of this kind, it's going to get messy. There is no perfect way of doing it. There's going to be all sorts of problems. And one of the things we did last year was set up an expert working group. It's about 20 brilliant people from around the world who are trying to flesh out what these principles mean in practice. And one of the things they've been doing is working on how it might be governed. And as an example, and I'll end with this. Money can't be anarchically spent. You have to have conditions. One of the big issues that I guess many of you will have studied is the conditions attached to lending, attached to cooperation, attached to grants by the major lenders, and how they undermine democracy in the short and long term, and how they're often wrong, and they push particular policies that probably the lenders think are right, certainly are generally in the interests of the people that manage of the countries that manage the lending institutions, and have been proved very, very regularly wrong in the past. So that's a problem of conditionality. But you can't have money without conditions, because that would be anarchy. So the question isn't whether you should have conditions or not. It's who are those conditions to, and who holds them accountable, and what are those conditions, and and who sets them. And so So can a system of global public investment lead to different sorts of accountability? So peer countries in a particular region or in a particular grouping hold each other to account for the money that is being lent or spent. And how does that fit into a broader continental, maybe, and global accountability mechanism, so that ultimately everything is responsible to an overall set of global goals and instructions made by presidents, maybe every 3 or 5 years, but there's a cascading of accountability to hold money accountable, but not in the way it's currently held accountable. So I guess in our imagination, by 2030, as the next Addis Ababa meeting is held to finance the next set of SDGs, global public investment will not be an afterthought, as it was in Addis, but will be a central pillar of what is required to promote sustainable development across the world. Not just because of its quantity, although we need tons more of it, but because of its special characteristics, because of the way it is newly governed, which will make it more effective and more representative of all the countries around the world. I'll stop there, Rory.